Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. In this episode, China makes plans for the future. This month's annual session of its legislature, the National People's Congress, or NPC, produced a slew of statements and documents aimed at boosting China's economy in the face of both slumping consumer confidence and the challenge of Donald Trump's tariffs on China's exports, currently 20%, with the threat of more to come. The main message from the leadership: promoting consumption and domestic demand as its top priority, with a special consumption action plan just announced, and pledges to boost entrepreneurship too, with a new law to protect private business which has faced many pressures in recent years. There was also much talk of high-tech industry, with a new venture capital fund aimed at raising over $130 billion for AI, quantum computing and hydrogen energy storage, and talk of everything from commercial space development to the low-altitude economy, which apparently means not just drones but also flying cars. So does this amount to the kind of bold plan that the economist Andy Rothman recently said on this podcast would be necessary to get Chinese consumers spending more? Or does the announcement that China's defence budget will rise by 7.2% this year, compared to its target for GDP growth of around 5%, suggest that the leadership's top priority is still security and stability? To discuss these issues, I'm joined by Professor Steve Zhang, Director of the SOAS China Institute and co-author of the recent book The Political Thought of Xi Jinping, and by George Magnus, former Chief Economist at UBS and a Research Associate at the Oxford University China Centre and also here at SOAS. Thank you both for joining us. George, what's your feeling about how seriously all these policies and announcements address China's economic problems?
Well, I was going to say it is quite serious, and I think the government does take the economy quite seriously. But then you said in addressing China's economic problems, and I'm a little bit hesitant to say that the way in which the government is interpreting and diagnosing China's problems is necessarily relevant or appropriate for the condition that China's economy finds itself in. So what do I mean by that? Is that one of the things that wasn't spoken about very much at the National People's Congress in the formal documents and certainly the speeches was trade. I mean, trade does appear as an important priority for the government, and they want to set up, more zones and cut business regulation and promote stronger exports. And of course, the whole industrial policy of the People's Republic of China is geared towards the promotion of specific industries in the modern sector, what Xi Jinping calls new productive forces or high quality development, the consequence of which is huge exports because, and this is the problem that China faces, there's not enough domestic demand to absorb all the production that China is now churning out. And whilst so far the rest of the world has been pretty absorbent, shall we say, of Chinese exports and excess production, there is a growing sense, I think, not just amongst developed market economies, but also amongst a range of middle-income countries and developing countries that are starting to rail against Chinese exports, not just of steel and basic products, which are essential to economic development, but also electric vehicles, for example, in the case of some countries, and even some manufacturers. So the 50 biggest countries in the world have all instituted what they call trade defense mechanisms against Chinese exports. So in a nutshell, I think that the government at the NPC certainly spent a lot of time to address domestic problems of inadequate demand. They made consumption their kind of number one task for 2025. And they're certainly very conscious about things that need to be done. But I think they are kind of almost glued to an economic strategy, which is precisely the antithesis of what they need to do to solve their domestic economic problems.
Could you expand on that? I mean, what do you think specifically was missing? Because clearly they have identified the falling consumer confidence as one of the keys that needs to be addressed in order to revive the Chinese economy, and therefore they're talking a lot about ways of boosting consumption. But what is it that structurally you think they've got wrong or missed out?
Well, the problem is that because of the nature of China's development model, which prioritizes industrial policy, production, supply, export, the demand side of the economy isn't really in balance with the supply side. And so to try to ameliorate that, what the government ought to be doing is to promote income growth, to promote income redistribution from state enterprises and local governments towards households and private firms, to transfer economic power from where it is to where it should be.
So you mean more away from the state?
Yes. And the trouble is, to do that, it's not just a question of transferring economic power, it's also political power to make decisions to spend and to so on and so forth. So that is why I think it's really awkward for the CCP, for the Chinese Communist Party, to embrace a consumption-oriented approach to economic policy. Instead, what they do really is they take a kind of an incremental approach. And I think, to be fair, there was a press conference on Monday after an announcement on Sunday, which was this big sort of consumption promotion plan, which does a number of different things. It does lift incomes, or aims to promote income growth for rural and urban workers. It aims to encourage people to save less. It repeats the trade-in scheme, which was announced.
You mean in order to save less in order to spend more, because
Yeah.
household savings are very high in China.
Yeah, so for example, there are minimalist increases in pensions and childcare and old age care and so on. So things that we would normally think about as public goods or redistribution. But a lot of what the government has promoted is really to crank up supply. They think that the reason people don't consume is because there aren't enough products or opportunities in culture. And they mentioned winter sports. They talk about opportunities for tourists to spend money. I mean, all of these things at the margin are kind of welcome, but they are really only at the margin. What China would really need is, a big program to shift income and wealth away from where it is, which is really in the state and state entities, to the private sector. But that's really a very, very politically challenging and perhaps even impossible task for them to accomplish, I think.
In terms of things like promoting income growth and attempting to get consumers to spend, as you say, they did introduce some measures and talked a bit about sectors of the service industry and boosting some welfare payments. And that was something that Professor Victor Shi of the University of California, San Diego identified as a core problem when we spoke to him on this podcast a couple of episodes ago. And he emphasized the fact that it's very much an issue of local governments having their budgets hit and struggling, particularly since the property sector has slowed down, and the way that has affected both jobs and income growth, and the fact that people, because of that, very much lack confidence. And we've also seen the sort of lack of confidence in the property sector, which was a key driver of China's economy, which has been hard hit in the last few years. So do you feel that they are taking these issues seriously, but they don't necessarily know how to tackle them in the way that you think is appropriate? Or do you think that they haven't fully realized what the problems are?
I think the party craves stability almost above everything else. I think there's a kind of a visceral distrust of the volatility and the uncertainty, which we associate normally with market outcomes and market-oriented solutions. And so the local government problem, which Victor has, certainly was one of the first, I think, to kind of draw attention to about a decade ago. It is a big problem. I mean, not across all 32 provinces, because obviously some in the eastern side, the seaboard provinces and so on are doing, much better than others. But there is a major problem with local governments, many of which have had to cut back on services, delay payments or non-payments. And that is a big problem. But it's only, it's a big part of the problem, but it's not all of it. I mean, part of the problem, I think, also is just a political reluctance. The government tends to focus almost exclusively on incremental change and not the direction of change. And what China really needs is a directional change in the way in which its model is structured. But that prospect, I think, seems pretty far out and dim.
I mean, they did talk about raising their budget deficits so that they're going to spend more and borrow more. And they've talked an enormous amount in the last couple of months about the private sector, and that actually goes back to the local government issue, because one of the points that many observers have mentioned recently is the fact that when local governments are short of money, they tend to try to solve that problem by imposing all kinds of fees, or in some cases fines, on private companies, from small businesses to bigger industrial players. And that's something the government has now talked a lot about wanting to address. And Xi Jinping made a point of meeting with delegates at the National People's Congress from Jiangsu province, just north of Shanghai, which is one of those key industrial provinces that has been such a driver of China's economy in the last few decades. And he told the delegation that Jiangsu must play a leading role in pioneering the integration of technology and innovation, and that they must deepen their market-orientated reforms and eliminate local protectionism, and treat all types of ownership enterprises equally, and improve the business environment. And these kind of comments were echoed by the Prime Minister Li Qiang, who in his work report, and he talked about sort of failings in providing services to companies. So they're very much talking the talk about boosting private enterprise and boosting production. Obviously, from George's point of view, that might lead to overproduction again. But Steve, what do you feel about the government's attitude towards these sectors of the economy? Over the years, it's been suggested that Xi Jinping is less focused on the economy and less of a natural enthusiast for private enterprise. How seriously would you say that he and the top leadership are committed to really addressing the problems of the private sector?
From the Chinese government's perspective, they both talk the talk and walk the walk, because they do seriously take the economy as a major challenge that needs to be addressed. But then here you get into the issue that George raised, which is the Chinese government understanding of the kind of economic challenges and what are needed to address them. And here you get into the issue of how Xi Jinping himself understands the economy and the relationship between the private sector and the state sector. Xi Jinping does finally accept that what had been done in the last few years about the private economy has not been as productive as it should be, and therefore adjustments are necessary, and adjustments were being announced at the National People's Congress. So that's actually happening.
So you're referring there to the way in which some of the big tech firms went through these difficult years where they were under investigation on many issues, and it felt that the government saw some of these top entrepreneurs as a threat, as maybe rivals to its power.
Well, that certainly is a part of it. The, if you like, rehabilitation of Jack Ma, it was much bigger than about bringing Alibaba back into play.
So this was his invitation to the meeting with entrepreneurs last month.
With Jack Ma and the whole range of other technology tycoons of China. And that was to signal very clearly that they are back. The Chinese government wants them to play an important dynamic role in pushing the economy forward, but they have never said anything to imply that they need to apologize for what they had done in cutting those tall poppies down. So the party has never been wrong, What it then boils down to is, yes, private enterprises, private entrepreneurs come and play your patriotic role, do it, but you still must all follow the leadership and the direction of the party and therefore the government. When Xi Jinping looks at the economy, he sees the strong performance of some of the tech sector in the Chinese economy as being a very positive sign. And he wants to steer the economy to do much more of that, rather than simply looking at supporting the general economy. There is a recognition of a need to promote consumption. Policies were announced, but as George explained, they absolutely refuse to look at the most fundamental, basic political problem behind the weak consumption in China. And that is, ironically, for a socialist country, it has an incredibly thin social welfare network, which means that people in China cannot afford to spend, particularly if you are in the lowest to the lower middle income groups. You cannot afford to spend because you have to save in case you have illness or in case you have other needs, losing your job or any similar type of things.
So this sort of lack of the iron rice bowl, which the Chinese system used to have, at least for urban residents, the fact that welfare payments and pensions are not high, apart from in a few of the major cities.
You have to have that feel-good factor. And before Xi Jinping, the Chinese economy was on a 30, 40-year streak of tomorrow will be better than today. So people could afford to spend a bit more and more. Now, people's economic prospect is no longer certain. And therefore, people have a stronger incentive to save at a time when the government actually want people to spend. So they are not providing enough of the kind of basic incentive to guarantee people spending. And then you add to the other problems that George already talked about in terms of the local government finance. Then it becomes very difficult for the domestic consumption to pick up and drive the economy. But a lot of this really goes back into the politics of it and the leaders' understanding of it. Xi Jinping is against it because Xi Jinping is against what he calls welfareism, and enhancing social security spending falls into the welfareism part of it. And his alternative approach is common prosperity.
It's an interesting point. I mean, when you talk about welfareism, it's very much sort of akin to something that people in the West might know, perhaps more in terms of Thatcherism or the kind of, rather conservative political attitudes from a Western point of view, where welfare is seen as just promoting laziness and not encouraging people to work. And so, as you say, somewhat ironically, that seems to have been the Chinese leadership's concern over recent years. But George, they've also talked a lot about wanting to boost things like the property sector and, all these measures to boost consumption. Do you feel that the people's mood is in any way likely to be reassured?
Well, to a degree. I mean, I think Steve spoke eloquently about, how Xi Jinping and the leadership views the private sector. And there's no question that, that the sort of the big onslaught against private firms is behind us. I mean, obviously they're not doing that. And the whole kind of the symposium with private entrepreneurs, rehabilitation of Jack Ma, the rhetoric, the need, and certainly the exploitation of AI, which is a huge thing in China, as everybody understands, particularly in the wake of DeepSeek. All of this stuff is true, but there's a lot to unravel here, because for the same reason as I kind of implied before, that you have to kind of contextualize why consumer confidence is low. It's not because people don't have ambition to spend, but it is definitely because the economy is not in a great shape and the real estate sector is in poor shape and house prices are falling and so on. But it's the same for the business sector as well. I mean, I think warm words and kind of slap on the back, we're all in this together kind of thing. I mean, all of this stuff is grist to the mill, absolutely a little bit of kind of mea culpa on the government side, because they do need the private sector to work with the party to achieve Xi Jinping's goals and so on. But business confidence is also low because A, the regulatory overhang hasn't really changed. The rhetoric has changed, but the regulatory burden or the regulatory system is still what it was. The restrictions, shall we say, on data management and transfer, the reporting requirements, the role of party committees in enterprises, which are kind of close to operational management. They can make money, but they have to basically also have party objectives as well as commercial objectives. So the overall business environment is very kind of state oriented, but also if businesses are making money hand over fist and they have widespread access to credit, you'll see their confidence, rise very, very sharply. So part of the reason that business confidence is down is because the business environment is not good, except for, of course, those firms that actually are receiving state largesse to promote self-reliance and so on and so forth.
But the average private company still finds it relatively difficult to get credit, to get bank loans in the way that big state-affiliated organizations can.
Yes, and the financial sector in China played such a huge role in China's economic eruption and the creation of housing market and infrastructure boom and so on and so forth.
So going back to the 90s,
2000s and so on. I'm told, really sort of the mid 2010s. But now the financial sector is really under the cosh. It's retrenching. And we're seeing kind of a long-term downshift, I think, in the role of finance in the economy.
Are you talking about the banks, basically, the state
banks and also non-banking financial institutions like insurance companies, wealth managers and so on. So China has great ambition to grow these sectors, of course, but the financial sector is kind of weighed down with too much debt and too many non-performing loans in the real estate and the infrastructure sectors.
So loans that they made to real estate developers or even local governments who've struggled to repay, and makes them even more unwilling to lend perhaps to private innovative companies.
Yeah, precisely, because what would happen is the banks would write off their bad debts, companies would go bust, people would get unemployed, and that would free up the resources for banks to lend to new companies or profitable enterprises. But of course, that can't really happen in China because the regulatory environment, from a financial point of view, is very kind of anti the idea of bankruptcy. Look at the property developers in China, which are sort of being kept going because it's too damaging and too painful to allow them to go to the wall. So you can't cut your lines to state borrowers and to developers because you're not allowed to, essentially.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned, Steve, I think the idea of Xi Jinping having talked about bringing sort of moderate prosperity for everyone, which was this Xiaokang Shehui was very much the buzzword that they were talking about in the 2010s. Some people have said that in recent years, there's been so much talk from the government about what a hostile international situation China faces, that this has also played a part in undermining consumer confidence. And I don't know how seriously that is an issue, but clearly we saw again in the government's work report that it's continuing to put a great emphasis on defense spending. There was also a news conference where they've talked in the last few days about Taiwan and trying to put pressure on the Taiwanese leadership after the Taiwanese president described China as an external hostile force, which obviously crosses Beijing's red line in that it implies that China and Taiwan are separate countries, and China, of course, sees Taiwan as part of its territory. So what's your feeling about, this balance between the government wanting to boost the economy, but at the same time being extremely focused on and concerned about the international situation, and particularly defense as regards its interests in Asia from the South China Sea to Taiwan?
There are a lot to unpick there. To start with, the, in quotation marks, hostile international environment that had come into place in the last 5 years or so really had much more to do with how the Chinese government handles the COVID pandemic by unleashing wolf warrior diplomats. And that's what turned a lot of countries beyond the United States, the first Trump administration, to take a very much more cautious approach towards engaging with China. So in that sense, apart from the first Trump administration, the hostile international environment was a product of Chinese foreign policy. Even with this, in quotation marks, hostile international environment, there is no evidence of any external threat to China's national security. I mean, that really went all the way back to the 1950s when Mao Zedong thought that the United States intended to invade China and use the Taiwan Strait crisis to test the American intentions and concluded that the Americans had no intention of invading China, but the Americans would fight over Taiwan. That was back into the 1950s. Not huge amount have changed in that basic strategic equation. So the fact that the Chinese economy does need a lot of attention and the projected target for growth is about 5%, and yet the annual defense budget increase is 7.2%, shows that priority is being put in building up China's military capability. I mean, we're talking about a Chinese military which in the previous 4 years managed to expand the size of its navy by the entire size of the Royal Navy of the United Kingdom. And that is being kept on track. But the existing Chinese fleet is more than capable of taking on any other regional navies in Southeast Asia. The Chinese Navy had already managed to send ships to sail up the American West Coast and circumnavigate Australia and deployed into the Middle East. So the Chinese Navy is a very capable blue water navy already. So they don't need to expand them in numbers in order to demonstrate the capabilities and scope of deployment of the Chinese Navy. They are building them up because ultimately they want to take Taiwan. And Xi Jinping is very, very clear about Taiwan. Taking Taiwan is part of the China dream of national rejuvenation, which is why it has to be fulfilled by the time frame set for the fulfillment of the China dream, which is 2049 or 2050, depending on which speech of Xi Jinping you want to use as the point of reference. It is about making China great again. And taking that step means the Chinese military must have the capability to take on the Americans either in deterrence terms or in actual deployment terms and win. And that's why they're expanding so much on it, even when the economy is clearly slowing down.
Well, we heard some quite sort of bellicose rhetoric in terms of trade also at this session of the Chinese legislature that has just finished, in which the Chinese leadership said that it would be willing to take on the US in a trade war or a tariff war, or indeed any type of conflict. But could I just ask you, George, you mentioned the question of Chinese exports. What's your feeling about whether China is going to be significantly hit by the type of tariffs that Donald Trump has introduced so far, and whether you think that there is a realistic prospect of the two sides coming to some kind of deal in the fairly near future?
Lots of things can be true here. So first of all, the additional 20% tariffs which the Americans have announced on Chinese products, it is something which I think, probably the Chinese economy can absorb with not too much difficulty. I mean, it's not always going to be painless, but I think it's going to be okay. And I think the retaliatory measures which the Beijing announced were of the type that basically says, we're just going to try and soft pedal this a little bit.
Because it has been noted that China has been less sort of outspoken in denouncing the tariffs that
Yes.
compared to countries in the West.
Yeah. And I think that's possibly because Beijing is still holding open the possibility, which is still being speculated about, as I think most people know, the possibility at least of a visit by Xi Jinping to Washington or vice versa. And it probably suits both sides. So the second thing is that it probably suits both sides to reach some kind of an agreement where they would say that they would increase their purchases from one another. And it's possible that this can happen. I mean, it's not beyond the wit of trade negotiators to hammer something out. But I think one has to see this as sort of a hiatus rather than a solution. I think it would be largely cosmetic because the structural deterioration in trade relations between the United States and China, I think, would be unaffected, really. And there is obviously, for both sides, an important sort of national security, expanded national security significance, which I think will continue to make them very wary about one another in terms of technology transfer and so on. There was one story that came out quite recently where the Chinese government is believed to have counseled or determined that BYD, the Chinese electric car manufacturer, may not be given permission to expand its production in Mexico because of the risk that technology transfer to the United States would be enhanced. Well, this is sort of pot calling the kettle black, but there you go. So the point I'm trying to make really is, which is the third point, which is that you can have both cosmetic type trade agreements, which is about it stepping up purchases from one another, but at the same time, the nature of the trade relationship is one that is basically essentially a relationship in conflict. It can't really be resolved because both sides really want to be top dog in technology and restrict one another from accessing best kept secrets.
Just to go back to one sector of the economy that we mentioned briefly, but which is obviously attracting lots of global attention at the moment, which is Chinese advances in AI and that area. What do you feel, George, about how significant a part of the Chinese economy and a part of China's advance into the wider world this could be, given the type of regulatory issues you mentioned earlier, where some people have said that obviously AI companies are hampered by various parts of China's regulatory system and the sort of political concerns about the type of work that they do.
Again, lots of things can be true here. So, from a Western perspective, obviously, I think we would probably have, and I think we probably do have reservations about DeepSeek and Manus and other kind of AI systems which are coming out all the time, simply because we are probably a little bit distrustful about information fed in, information derived out, so censorship and so on. But having said that, inside China, I think it's kind of all systems go, really. I mean, lots of companies and individuals. I mean, the anecdotal reports about the spread and usage of intensity of usage of AI systems since DeepSeek has been quite remarkable.
Yeah, all the local governments seem to have been taking it up with
Yeah,
alacrity.
yeah. And I think what China is doing here, actually, in some respects, is typical of what it has done in lots of other things, which is it's proven to be extremely adept at scaling things up and producing them at minimal cost. And I think the access to and usage of the systems actually obviously is going to positively, increase as a consequence. So I think they are a big force to be reckoned with in AI. There's no question about it.
But just briefly, George, do you think that this type of funding, this enormous sounding venture capital fund of over $100 billion US that China's National Development and Reform Commission announced for boosting AI and all these other advanced high-tech industries, I mean, do you think that money will make a significant difference? It says it will come from a mixture of local governments and the private sector. Now, as we've said, the local governments may be struggling for funds themselves.
Certainly, if the central government in China is going to rely on local governments to fund this, you'd have to be a little bit skeptical, I think. But maybe, the sort of allocation of priorities or, the sort of requirements for what local governments do could change. I mean, I wouldn't rule out the fact that, large quantities of money could be raised. Whether it will be put to good effect, I think, is a different question entirely.
And Steve, one point which perhaps sheds some light on the Chinese leadership's current thinking is this ongoing anti-corruption campaign, which obviously over the last decade or more has seen enormous numbers of Chinese officials punished. But there have been a number of articles by scholars, particularly in the US, Min Sin Pei and Wu Guoguang, just in recent weeks about the continuing sort of takedown of officials at quite high levels in various cities and provinces around the country because of allegations of corruption. What do you feel about this campaign? Because some people had thought that it would slow down, and that if they're going to focus more on the economy, this won't be a priority. What does that tell us?
The anti-corruption campaign in China is a misdescription. It is not primarily about anti-corruption, and it certainly is not a campaign. A campaign has a starting point and an ending point. This one doesn't. I would call it an anti-corruption party ratification drive. And it will continue and be sustained for as long as Xi Jinping remains in power. He calls it the self-revolution of the Communist Party. He has to constantly keep his party cadres on toes in order to make sure they all follow his orders. It also in some ways reflects that for all that focus on extending his Leninist-style control over the party apparatus and imposing discipline and ideological shaping of people's thinking, the whole thing has not been quite as successful as he would like it to be. So I think we can expect to see more of that to be sustained moving forward.
And do you think that the continuing detentions of officials, often with a kind of economic role in local government, so is that going to affect how the private sector sees these attempts to reassure private enterprise, or will it in some ways be seen as positive because it might suggest that local governments grabbing money from private companies is very much under scrutiny at the moment?
I think we need to look at this at two different levels. I think at the more general academic level, the general atmosphere for the private entrepreneurs in China is now a lot less supportive than it was 12, 15 years ago. And that is simply a reality, and it must have some general effect. But having said that, then we have to look at the other level, which is at a very practical operational level. If you were a Chinese entrepreneur operating in China and you are not going to be able to get out, then what do? You work within the limits of the environment that you face. So however much more restrictive and unfriendly it is, if you still see scope for making money, you keep doing it anyway. So I think you have a lot of that, and I would not therefore see the private sector, the private entrepreneurs in China as people who just thought, oh no, the environment is just now too hostile, it's not worth my while. The spirit of Chinese entrepreneurship, I think, remains strong in China.
And it is something that has flourished over recent decades, often without complete regulatory support. So just overall, Steve, do you have a sense of whether, at least for the coming couple of years, we are in some ways going to see what you could call a more pragmatic approach to economic issues domestically? This was something that Andy Rothman, the economist, talked to us about on the podcast last month, where he said that, the party in the end, despite its many ideological concerns, has always, in recent decades, tended to go back to pragmatism when it faces problems. Do you see a more genuine commitment to, boosting the private sector and focusing on the economy in the years ahead? Or do you think that there's not going to be a major change despite what's been said in the last couple of months?
I think what underpins Andy Rothman's comments is the realism that Xi Jinping shows. He is ultimately a realist. He is ultimately most concerned about himself and the party staying in power, and therefore he will do whatever it takes to deliver those goals. And that's why there is an element of pragmatism. But where I think we need to be looking at it more smartly is to resurrect the concept that Chen Yun, the economic guru of China in the period of the reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping, his concept of the bird cage for managing the economy. The bird cage has never disappeared. But from the Deng Xiaoping through the Jiang Zemin to the Hu Jintao era, the bird cage got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it got to so big that a lot of the time we did not notice that the bird cage was there.
So just to clarify, this is the idea that the economy could develop in a sort of fairly capitalist direction, but within a structure, a kind of overarching framework that was still a communist system or party control, shall we say?
The birdcage is the party controlling everything. The private economy is the little birdie inside the birdcage. Now, Xi Jinping has reduced the size of the birdcage, and he's doing it in a 21st century digital era way, which is, in quotation mark, a smart birdcage, that it can extend and it can contract as required, when required, and even the shape of it can actually varies a bit, as required and instructed by the party state. So we are going to see that continue moving forward. There will be ups and downs in terms of the scope for the private enterprises to move, and it depends on which part of the private sector you belong to. If you, for example, belongs to a sector that the party state that Xi Jinping sees as top priority, your part of the birdcage will get enlarged more than the average of the rest of the birdcage. I mean, your example would be DeepSeek. I mean, at the moment, DeepSeek is the darling of the Chinese industrial innovative sector. So if DeepSeek needs a bit more scope to do cutting edge stuff, I think at the moment they will get it, just like Alibaba used to get it until Alibaba didn't.
Because Alibaba then eventually faced this crackdown, the suspension of its IPO for Ant Financial. And George, can I just ask you overall, from the things that you've heard said and the things that you've read coming out of the Chinese system in the last month or so, and particularly over the National People's Congress period, what's your feeling about where the Chinese economy is likely to be, say, in 1 or 2 years' time?
Well, I think on a kind of a 1 to 2 year view, I mean, I expect the government will be able to manage the economy pretty much as it has been. I mean, it's going through kind of a regular kind of cyclical vibrations now of deceleration, stimulus, limited stimulus, pick up again, deceleration. I mean, the question mark really is what happens? I mean, it's probably beyond a 1 year to 18-month horizon. But what happens if the economy is in this kind of adjustment, which I think it is, to a permanently low growth rate, but constantly needs TLC and stimulus of some description in order to keep going? And so China is going to reach this point at some stage, where either it's going to become a much more, even further, repressive and diktat kind of oriented kind of economic entity, or it'll be forced to open up again. But Leninists don't do that really, do they? So I think the pragmatism argument is sort of a bit of a historical baggage, really. I think some really, really big decisions are going to confront the leadership in years to come, but probably not in the next 12 months.
But going back to the slightly shorter term, do you see that China will see a kind of a relative uptick in consumption with all these measures? Because we are likely to see perhaps the export growth that led the way last year slowing down.
We should see, I think, mathematically, a somewhat stronger contribution of consumption to reported growth in the next 12 months. But that doesn't mean that anything is really changing underneath. I mean, you can't really have a permanent change in the role of consumption in the economy unless you actually give people the wherewithal to spend, which means income growth, redistribution of income and wealth. And I don't think that's going to happen, really. Incremental change, not substantial change.
Well, George Magnus and Professor Steve Zhang, thank you both very much for joining us on China in Context.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for in this episode. You can find our previous episode on the Chinese economy with Victor Shi and Andy Rothman on your usual podcast platforms, or on our website soas.ac.uk, where you can also find more information about SOAS China Institute events and read our latest blog articles from scholars and commentators. For now, thank you for listening and goodbye.